very, very nice. A few years ago, there was a fantasy novel that came out, which was wildly successful in terms of sales, and was particularly well regarded by critics and readers who enjoy reading that genre. It told the story of, shall we say, a young sorcerer. And the book was called The Name of the Wind. And this young sorcerer knew the name of the wind. And in the world of this novel, if you knew something's name and were able to utter it, you would have control over that thing. And this young sorcerer knew the name of the wind, and so he could call upon the wind to blow. What was interesting is that the young sorcerer didn't know the name of the wind consciously. He knew it unconsciously. And only in times of great emotion, fear or anger or some other kind of emotion which would stir alive his unconscious reactions, would he be able to utter mysteriously this unknown name of the wind and to call upon it to blow. This made him a very dangerous and feared character. As we all know, though, the wind is a great and a powerful thing. The ancients, the Greeks and the Romans considered it one of the elements that made up the substance of the world. We know in our day and age just how powerful the wind can be, many of us. This very city, many years ago, was the site of a very infamous and destructive tornado, which caused much damage and took a number of lives. And some of you may remember the day that those high winds blew through Barrie. Just a few weeks ago, we experienced some very high winds in this area. I was told later on that the winds reached the speed of 110 kilometers an hour. All over the place, trees were blown over and things were picked up and carried by the wind. I lost some shingles off my roof, and my roof is quite new. And yet the power of the wind ripped the shingles right off the west side of my roof. One of the times in my life when I was most nerve-wracked was caused by high winds. A number of years ago, I was driving over the Burlington Skyway going southward when a storm front began to blow in off of Lake Ontario. And all of a sudden, these great high winds blew in and began to shake my car and presumably the cars around me. And I was very glad a few minutes later to be back on the ground. The wind is such a powerful thing that as long as humans have been able, we have tried to harness in some way the power of the wind, whether it be to sail a ship or in more recent times by using windmills to create electricity. Robin read beautifully just a few moments ago the story of Pentecost from the book of Acts. Pentecost was a very important festival in ancient Judaism. Jews from all over the world, wherever there were Jews, had made pilgrimage to Jerusalem to gather and to be together, to worship and to celebrate the goodness of God. The disciples of Jesus were there in Jerusalem being part of the pilgrimage for that festival. The narrator of the book of Acts tells us that they were together in one place when suddenly and unexpectedly the room where they were sitting was filled with what seemed to be a great and a mighty wind. It appeared to them even as though there were tongues of fire dancing over each of their heads. This wind, as it rushed into the room where they were, made a great and a calamitous noise. The noise was such that it was heard throughout that city. The pilgrims, wherever they were at that time, followed the noise to see what had happened. They began to gather and to congregate in the area of the place where the disciples were staying. You could imagine the conversation. What was that? Did you hear that? We might even imagine that it sounded something like an earthquake or perhaps a building falling down. A great wind that shook that city. And as the crowds gathered and congregated and tried to figure out amongst themselves what had happened, what had made that great noise, had it been a wind? The disciples of Jesus emerged from the place where they had gathered, and they began in the mysterious and wonderful and fearful power of God to proclaim the good news of God and of Jesus in all of the different languages of the people that had gathered as pilgrims in Jerusalem for that Pentecost festival. The narrator of the book of Acts lists a series of peoples and nations from which these Pentecost pilgrims had gathered. What's especially remarkable and for me always striking about this story is the way the list of nations and peoples from which those pilgrims had come includes among them peoples and nations which no longer existed in the first century. And you see, the narrator of the book of Acts knew this. And it was the narrator's way of saying that the whole world was there. People of every nation and every tongue, people from all times and places were there. And in the mysterious and wonderful and fearful power of God, these 11 probably largely uneducated people from the backwater of Galilee were proclaiming the good news of the mighty acts of God in all of their own languages for them to hear and to know and receive. Some in the crowd mocked the disciples. That was their defense mechanism, their reflex, I suppose. Their way of putting up a barrier between themselves and the movement of God. Many, however, among the crowd believed. They saw and heard what was happening, knew it could only be the maker of the universe, and came to faith. That day of Pentecost marked the beginning of an incredible transformation among the people present and the beginning of an incredible transformation among humankind. Faith in Jesus exploded that day. Transformation in lives exploded that day. The growth of an incredibly remarkable, diverse, and loving community exploded that day. And the growth of that community continued to explode in the days and weeks and months and years and decades and centuries ahead. It was the birth and explosion of a community such as the world has never seen. Built life by life in personal transformation, and built act by act of loving kindness by one towards a neighbor. The wind of God that blew that day continues to blow still, continues to blow all over the world among every people and nation, such as the good news of God's mighty acts is proclaimed in every language for all to hear. Think about it. In our city, so far removed in time and distance and culture and mindset and in every way from that day so long ago, there are some 70 congregations of Christians which meet in this city, worshiping the same God, celebrating the same good news, experiencing the power of the same Spirit, the same wind and the same movement of God. All around the world, the same thing is happening. All around the world, young people are educated in schools started by Christians out of their faith. All around the world, people are treated in hospitals started by Christians out of their faith. All around the world, people are fed who are hungry by Christians out of their faith. All around the world, people receive nursing care, a profession begun by a Christian out of her faith. The wind of God still blows in power in our world today, and it blows in this very place. It is a high wind, so exercise caution. As sin and evil are overcome, in their place come transformation and community and love and worship and proclamation of the mighty deeds of God. And we do not need to be sorcerers to know the name of this wind. It is no mystery at all. Nor do we need to have our subconscious unlocked by some kind of traumatic experience. The name is known for all to hear. The name of that wind is the Holy Spirit. The power and the presence of God, alive and at work, not only around the world, but in our midst and in our hearts. Praise be to God.